Hello and welcome to the UK India Business Council and SKP Group's second presentation on conducting compliance investigations in India. Today is part 2 of our series, and our expert speaker Sundar from SKP Group will be discussing the approach towards compliance investigations. The ever-evolving compliance architecture is gradually aiming to strengthen the vigilant mindset of large corporations, transforming them to exert policies and procedures and to strengthen internal controls. Handling concerns raised by employees and third parties are essential to maintain the fabric of compliance and keep the reputation intact. In this recording, we will explore approaches that are being used to handle different facets of handling and internal investigations. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to our speaker Sundar to begin his presentation.
Welcome all of you. Thanks for the introduction, Becky. So here, this is part of the 4-part series webcast that we were discussing about on compliance investigations in India. In the last webcast, we looked upon the types of compliance scenarios and the issues around it. We also looked at multiple evidence sources along each of these aspects. Today we will be looking at the approach towards investigation and the legal considerations one may want to look at when conducting compliance investigations in India. I'm going to touch upon 2 primary factors. One is the overall approach towards conducting investigations, which will be more like a guideline on what you need to consider when you're actually conducting a compliance investigation in India. Second is broad level parameters, more a practitioner perspective of the legal considerations, which you may want to consider in compliance investigation. For specific case reference or the legal perspectives, you may want to consult a legal or a legal counsel for specific advice. So this is going to be a very broad level guideline. Now, getting on to the presentation, we are going to be taking more, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the overall approach, where there are multiple factors in terms of how do you understand the whistleblower's concern to how the reporting of compliance investigation is going to be. We will also consider a couple of factors relating to the legal course of action that one may want to consider and when to involve the legal aspects as such during the compliance investigation. To start with, one primary thing that we need to set the tone clearly is that a compliance investigation has a regulatory involvement or regulatory reporting requirement at certain point in time, or even a regulatory oversight at certain point in time. Considering the complexities that may be there, one should be aware of the aspects that they are considering at the point of conducting the investigation. So a case or a particular concern may arise from any source. It could arise from a third-party source. It could arise from a whistleblowing as a channel. It could arise from the regulator themselves, or it could arise from a management review mode. Idea is to gather specific evidence to see if there is a substantiable evidence to say the particular concern is validated or not, or to say the particular concern is substantiated or not. When we look at it from that standpoint, there are 5 to 6 elements that we are looking at. What are these 5 to 6 elements? Essentially, these 5 to 6 elements are the sources of evidence. In a workplace environment, you have multiple forms of sources of evidences. The forms and sources of evidences, like we briefly saw in our last webcast, it is about what documentations exist within the system, what data exists within the system, what digital records exist within the system, what are the interviews or conversations that you are able to gather from people, what are the external market information that you are able to gather. All these are sources of information, and these sources of information are going to contribute in you determining whether there is any merit in the concern that is common for investigation. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and brief you about 6 key elements one may want to consider while conducting compliance investigation. There could be one or two more elements that may come up more circumstantial basis, but these will broadly cover the essentials one may want to consider during compliance investigation. These 6 elements are understanding the whistleblower concern. So a whistleblower may come back with a specific concern. So one must understand the source of the concern, the purpose of the concern, and what facts that the whistleblower says in his concern. So we will learn more about how one should examine a whistleblower communication in the subsequent slides. Now, the second point is digital forensic approach. With a lot of data becoming extremely digital driven, with organization becoming digital driven, there is a lot of digital information that remains, be it in terms of your emails, email communications, be it in terms of files, be it in terms of your communication channel, workflow, everything is digital driven. So in these cases, there is a lot of evidence that is possible in the subject's machine or suspect's machine or the server, as the case may be. How are you utilizing forensic tools for you to extract relevant evidence and preserve them so that you are able to represent in the court of law, or at least take that as a help for you to evaluate the validity of the concern. The third point is data analytics. Like I said, it is not just digitally driven. The organizations are also more data driven. So besides the financial numbers, there are operational tools that are available, operational data that are available. There are certain type of organizations which may have even data relating to their design, data relating to their proprietary information. All these information could also be relevant depending on the nature of the case for you to examine or analyze. So that is a specific step an investigator should consider while conducting investigation on compliance. Next parameter one must consider is the documentation review. The documentation review piece that we are speaking about is about any form of documentation that may exist in an organizational environment. The forms of documentation that exist in the organizational environment will include your financial reporting documentation, your invoices, or your HR records, or contracts, as the case may be. Many of these documentation will provide insights into critical red flags that are relevant for the investigation. The next point is about interview. So this could be an internal interview or a discrete interview. The idea of interview is to gather further information or to seek clarificatory information with reference to the context of the concern. Now, through the processes of digital forensic, data analysis, or documentation review, one may have already gathered a lot of evidences that's relevant for the case. Now, after gathering those evidences, one should also be in a position to validate it or seek clarification based on the evidence with the subject, so that the conversation extends to the stage of admission seeking. Because the ultimate objective of the whole process is to get to the admission seeking interview and ensure that the evidences substantiate the concern in question. The last part is the reporting approach. As part of the reporting approach, we're going to be speaking broad guidelines of how one should put in a report and what are the essentials to consider and what are the do's and don'ts while preparing a report on compliance investigations. We will start with the first part, which is the whistleblower's mindset part. Now, many a times the whistleblower may not know all the facts. Let me step back and give you a contextual reference. Whistleblower is a person who may be within the organization or who may be outside the organization. Not necessarily a whistleblower is going to be raising concern only about the work or the area that he is exposed to. He may be raising concern on any other area also. For example, he may be raising concern saying that there are certain materials that are taken outside the factory without gate pass. And that guy could be from HR department. So in this particular example, the whistleblower does not have any role to play in materials moving out of the factory. Still, he is noticing and observing something and he is coming back and reporting it as part of good governance, as part of ethical practices. When such information are reported, we should be aware as investigators that the whistleblower does not have complete visibility of all the facts. So the whistleblower is aware of certain facts and is not aware of certain facts. It is the responsibility of the investigator to gather specific information to validate the concerns of the whistleblower. Many a times, a whistleblower is into multiple confusions. The confusions are whether a particular issue is a problem. For example, I said an example of transporting of materials without a gate pass. The whistleblower first needs to convince himself that it's a problem. For him to convince himself it's a problem, because it is possible that he has been noticing it as a practice that's been happening for a while. So he would not know whether it is a problem or not. In many organizations, let's say, if a reporting manager of the whistleblower has a certain practice, if he extends the day of book closure, or if he says that you can actually modify the numbers before reporting, if that is the practice that is followed, then the whistleblower may also consider them as the way of business. In those cases, he will not identify it as a problem. Second, the whistleblower may not be aware of what he should be doing, if it's a problem, whether he should be reporting or not, right? And he will also have concerns on what should I report, because what he knows may not be very clear to him itself. So he will have confusion on what will I report if I'm not clear myself. Then the last thing is, how will it affect me, or what will happen to me? Because a lot of times whistleblowers are afraid of the penal consequences that they may face out of they blowing the whistle. Now, these are the 3-4 key parameters that we are considering as part of a whistleblower's mindset. A whistleblower manages to get out of this mindset and then reports. Hence, we need to be aware that not all the facts that he brings onto the table may be completely valid. A lot of information could be fictional. Now, how to understand from a whistleblower? There is a method called be aware. The investigators should use this method for gathering information from the whistleblower. This method primarily covers few factors. The first thing one should do is to get a brief of every event and every issue that is in question with regard to the concern that the whistleblower raises, and ask him for the kind of evidences that he has, and analyze every document and evidence that the whistleblower may provide. For example, in a very peculiar circumstance where the fraud or the compliance issue is happening outside your company premises, it's happening at your partner company premises, which you do not have access of, then what you're actually doing is you're relying on the whistleblower evidence as a primary information for you to initiate your process. So when you collect information from the whistleblower, you should also seek what evidences he has and what makes him believe that this is an issue. In some cases where it is incident-based investigation, incident-based compliance issues, it is better that somebody does a walkthrough or somebody does a physical visit. It helps in understanding what is the circumstance around it. Then you need to also ask the whistleblower what is accepted practice, what is not accepted practice. That's when it becomes more clearer on what deviation the whistleblower is attempting to explore. And it is also better to ask questions on the roles and responsibilities of people involved. Sometimes the whistleblower may have answers to it, sometimes he may not, but that information helps in seeking clarity at a later stage on how that incident had manifested. The last but not least is to inquire about the incident as to why the whistleblower considers it as an exception. Not necessarily just because a particular material is sent out of the premises without gate pass. It does not mean that it needs to be an exception. For example, it could even be a return of a material which is incorrectly delivered here, or return of a material which is damaged at the time of delivery. In that case, the company may be returning those materials to their supplier. Understanding the whistleblower concerns is very critical, while parallelly understanding the evidences that exist in digital forensic is also relevant. There are 4 to 5 parameters that we are going to be speaking about in this. Digital forensic is about gathering evidences from digital data of the organization. Now, with everything being digital, the first most important thing is to have a chain of custody. Chain of custody ensures that the asset or the evidence was handled with appropriate care, and there's a trial of who handled it and how the evidence moved across people and how the final outcomes have been represented. So that chain of custody is one of the critical factors. It could be applicable for the evidence or for the devices as the case may be. The second aspect is disk imaging. When we are speaking about imaging, it is about creating a mirror copy of the existing suspect disk or data and then using it for the purpose of analysis. When we are saying mirror copy, it also copies information that are supposedly deleted, and it also copies information and retains information like the timestamps. So a mirror copy does not change the file signature, so that the evidence is appropriately retained. After collecting, one would be in a position to extract the deleted information as part of this process, and this extraction helps in seeing if there are possible evidences which were deleted during the process. The third part is understanding the context of the case. The context of the case is very critical to understand. Before you start the review, it is necessary to understand how the suspects or subjects disk is. What is the pattern in which he is organized? For instance, the way you would organize your mailbox, the way you would organize your files may be completely different from your colleague. It is necessary for somebody to observe, the investigator to observe how the whistleblower is organizing his evidences. It makes it easier for the whistleblower, for the investigator to use that as a profiling mechanism and then understand how relevant evidences could be gathered in a short time. We also need to consider something called profiling. Profiling is an approach through which you are gathering a specific information about what kind of information does the subject stores where, and what kind of mechanisms or folder structure that he has within the system, with whom does he communicate with whom does he communicate with in BCC, whether he actually shares data with someone, what kind of data that he handles, and also information on what kind of approvals that he normally gives. This information gives you a more crystal idea of what is the profile of the subject. It becomes easier for you to focus on evidentiary parameters that may help in the context of the case. The other part that we are going to be speaking about is of review and analysis. The review process consists of 2 to 3 parameters. One is looking at the keyword searches. After you do the profiling, based on the nature of issue that you want to cover as part of the process, you also do something called keyword searches. You identify keywords that may be relevant for you to gather essential evidence, and you review all the searches or the files or the communications that come up as part of the searches. The second one is to do a pattern analysis. So, for example, if a subject does not have communications for a particular month, for example, if you are reviewing a mailbox of X as a subject, X has been there with the organization for about 5 years, and you do not see any communications in his mailbox for 2 months. Then you're actually looking at a pattern to see if there are any gaps in the data, right? This pattern could be also in different forms in terms of where you're looking at user-driven approach. For instance, if the issue in concern is relating to falsification of certain documentation, filtering and looking at documentation which were created or modified by the user or by the subject can also be a kind of pattern analysis. The last one in this segment is unsearchable data review. There may be certain elements of data where it is not directly searchable. These data are there in the disk, but these data points are not very visible. They call it as unallocated clusters. So the hard disk is divided into multiple clusters, of which some of them are allocated, and you are able to view it as part of your logical partitions. And there are unallocated clusters where you will not be in a position to view it, where you may have deleted files and other files. So when you recover deleted files, as we spoke in the previous segment, the recovery is only for complete files. Now, you may have a partial file where you are not able to gather all the elements of the file as part of recovery because it has got overwritten. In those instances, those pieces of information are reviewed as part of the unsearchable data review. The last segment in digital forensic review is consolidation and tagging. Once you start your review focused on the objective, you need to see how you are able to consolidate notes, consolidate the timeline of events, and you tag the issues as part of relevance so that you are able to retrieve the evidences that are necessary for the purpose of the investigation. With that said, we move to the next segment. The next segment is about data analytics. Like we spoke briefly, organization has a lot of different types of data. Sometimes the data that they have may be in a varied form. It requires interpretation, analytics, and also arriving at meaningful conclusion. So, primary thing before you start on with data analytics with regard to the concern in question is to determine what are the objectives that you have for analyzing this data. What is that you want to measure, and how do you want to measure that objective? Is there adequate data that is available with the organization, or there are limitations in the data? How are you collecting the data and ensuring that the data that is considered for analysis is not manipulated or modified. And doing an analysis of data is one of the very critical portions where you are primarily trying to correlate information, analyze trends and patterns, and also look at information that is exception to the existing controls. So when you actually look at these three factors, you are trying to gather the evidence from the data trends for the issue in concern. The last one is about interpreting results. Let's say there is an exception. When you actually do a data analytics, your approach should be focused on what is the norm. So when there is a type of data, the type of data could be a HR data, financial data, or it could be even an operational data. These data sets, the primary thing for us to establish is to see what is the norm that the data throws out and what is the exception it has. The natural understanding of the norm and exception will bring in a lot of understanding of data before you actually get into the transactional validation of exception. The interpreting results will be very critical, and it has to be essentially aligned with the nature of data and how you're considering exceptions in the data. With that said, let's move on to the next segment of documentation review. In an investigation scenario, you may have multiple instances of documentation or multiple types of documentation. For instance, if you are looking at an infrastructure segment review, in an infrastructure segment kind of a review, you may have multiple types of documentation. There will be engineer's report, there will be gate security report, there will be report of subcontractor, there will be report of the operations manager, and there will be report if it is a construction company or infrastructure company, the customer will also have a report of the progress. Now these multiple progress reports, when you actually look at and cross-validate, you will understand that there may be a lot of inconsistencies that are there in reporting of each of the facts in these cases. And if that is the source or course of the investigation, those documentations will be of a lot of relevance. Understanding the document types and what kind of evidences it can throw during the process is the first step in that sense. Cross-correlating of information across documentation. Now, different documentation carries different set of information, and they will also have certain common set of information. What happens in an investigation scenario? Let's say if we are speaking about a bidding scenario, there was one review where we were actually looking at a red flag. There were 3 bids that have come in from 3 different parties, in fact, for a tender. When you are looking at the documentation of those 3 bids, you notice that the fax number, the originating fax number for all these 3 are same. And this originating fax number, based on public records, it appears that it belongs to which belongs to our a particular issue of concern, or a particular evidence which relates to one of the bidders. In those, it basically exhibits that there is interrelationship between parties, and that could become a core evidence in a compliance investigation. Highlighting key clusters of information within document. It is also necessary for the investigator to look at what portion of documentation or what portion of information within the documentation is relevant for the purpose of investigation. And once all this is done, once the documents are cross-correlated, key factors are pulled in, it is also necessary to create a chain of events. Chain of events could be with reference to the issue of concern or with reference to the context of the concern. When I say context, it is about the process, or it is about the particular incident. So that is something one should be in a position to put together. After they put together the chain of events and the reflect that they find from the documentation review, they should also correlate which of the people were associated with each of this and how these events are coming up. Once you are able to gather these set of information, you should correlate all these outcomes with what you find from a digital forensic, what you find from data analytics. With that said, we move on to the next and very important segment of interviewing. Investigation interviews are a very critical part, and it is about handling humans in a particular segment. So my suggestion is it should have a human face when you conduct interviews. And there are 5 critical points one should consider while conducting interviews. The first thing is about developing trust. The subject or the suspect, whatever facts that he has, he will share only when he is comfortable to share or when he doesn't have any defenses to share. So developing trust is much easier way to actually convince this in the process. Second point is to understand the context. How a person understands the overall context of the concern and understands the events around it and also seeks clarity from the subject on the evidences is very, very important. One should not be becoming judgmental, or one should not attempt to validate facts and understanding by being judgmental. While gathering these information from the subject, it is necessary to validate every element of fact that the subject says. The element of facts could be in terms of data, in terms of events, or in terms of people. Either you should be in a position to validate them during the interview, or you should be in a position to cross-validate and get back to them in the subsequent conversation. But validating the information that you get is very, very essential. And the last but not the least, be empathetic. There are instances where certain subjects are going out of the way and they are crossing the ethical line. That does not mean that they should be branded that way. So being empathetic and having a humane in us in specifically handling emotions of those subjects will go a long way in developing trust and also helping in concluding the case in a more focused manner. With this, we are overall closing on the approaches towards gathering evidence. The next part that we're going to be speaking about is about how certain elements within the interview process, besides the broad elements, certain elements within the interview process may be critical for one to consider while doing an interview. For instance, a subject may have a certain way of responding. Behavioral factors play a critical role while conducting interviews. One of the primary steps to do is how does the subject behave initially, and how does the subject behave when certain specific questions are asked, and what is his reaction, response for those questions. Now this concept is called baselining. An approach of baselining is to understand what is the normal behavior and correlate it with an abnormal behavior that may happen when you ask a sensitive, critical, or admission-seeking question. One should understand how to do the baselining. The approach towards baselining is to focus on the initial few minutes and then set a rapport with the subject. Speak with him about where he comes from, what is his role, how he thinks about his role, what he thinks about his role, and what he is looking forward to from a overall context. So, and all the questions that you need to be asking for should be questions where there will be a base level factual response from the subject. Only then you will have better way to to do a baseline. When to baselining is a process that can continue through the interview, but the primary baselining happens at the initial phases of the interview. There may be certain hotspots that may be there in terms of the response. In terms of response, it could be the physical behavioral reference, palm getting wet for the subject, or he sitting closed arm position. All those could be specific hotspots that could be there. There could be non-verbal clues in terms of how the subject is sitting, how the subject is responding to a particular question, right? And there could be verbal clues of he giving a lot of gaps before responding, repeating the same question that you have asked, or taking time, having a lot of fillers. All these are things that you need to correlate with what was there at the baselining stage. With that said, we are now looking into beyond the evidence gathering approach, now specifically on reporting approach. There are broad 5 to 6 guidelines that we're going to be speaking about. These guidelines are indicated so that a person is able to write a more effective report. Report writing is primarily intended toward communication of facts. So for the formal communication of facts, what could be the 5 to 6 things one should consider? There should be contextual information. A report should have a background for the reader so that they are able to relate to it contextually. A report without a contextual reference may not make a lot of sense for some of the readers. It could be an investor who may be reading it. It could be a lawyer who may be reading it. They may or may not understand the contextual reference relating to a technical aspect of the investigation. So it is necessary to start with a background. One should also determine what are the critical findings that are there that needs to be reported. Looking at critical findings is important way to start our reporting process, because the reports should speak about what is the ultimate outcome that is coming out of the investigation. The third thing is sticking to facts. As investigators, it is necessary to not get biased. It is of utmost importance to not have opinionated views. It should stick to facts. What is the fact and what is the base for your fact? What is the evidence that you have relied on for that fact? Sometimes the evidences could be the base policies of the organization, the base practices. Sometimes it could come from even the conversations that you would have had with others, the whistleblowers, suspect, as the case may be. So all those should be the support for the references that you are giving. In addition to this, when we said as evidences, you should also give reference to what is the general practice that is followed, what is the policy that exists in that particular process. So the general practice and the policy clarifies the role or gives adequate reference to the reader for them to understand or take this in the context of the report. It is necessary for the language to be extremely simple. A complex language undermines the content of the communication that is mentioned in the report. The objective of the report is to ensure that what is the issue? who is the perpetrator, what is the value at risk or what is the fraud loss, what are the controls that have failed, and who has the oversight responsibility. Now, when we mention these 5 to 6 points, that covers all of the issue that we are speaking about. Having the language as simple as possible helps the reader to understand the outcomes of the investigation better. Qualitative words or adjectives or vague things should be avoided. Anybody mentioning that this is extremely high, it's a very subjective word. Why should one use extremely high? Unless and otherwise you are able to relate to a particular context and say proportionally high by so much. So avoiding vague words or adjectives is also one of the important factors an investigator should consider while collating the report. Now moving on to the next part is of when you should involve legal. One should involve legal in 3 scenarios. Scenario number 1 is what kind of case it is. If the case involves a specific set of stakeholders or third parties, you may want to cover the risks, legal risk associated with it, and hence involve a legal professional. Second, where if suspect legal of complications, it could be with a business partner, key managerial personnel, as the case may be, where the issue is very sensitive and you suspect that it may go off track. Or the third area where you advise on guiding through the issue. You seek advice on guiding through the issue. So it could be that you want to gather evidence and you seek advice on gathering the evidence or securing the evidence or legal considerations from how you should be proceeding with some of the specific aspects of gathering evidence. For instance, if you want to interview a particular senior management employee, what precautions that you should take before you actually conducting the interview? That would be something that you would want to get a guideline from the legal team. So these are the 3 broad elements where you may have requirement and you consider inputs from the legal team. While this is broad, there could be other specific instances where there may be requirements. With that said, we move on to the next segment of what is the support that you should look for post-investigation scenario. So, or during the investigation scenario. Some of the things that one should consider is, if we go from the last, we're speaking about consolidating and securing evidence. Okay, that's the first step where you want to consolidate the evidence and secure the evidence clear. Second is agreeing on the legal approach for conducting the investigation, or what are the legal considerations one should consider while doing interview, while gathering evidence, while speaking with someone, while writing the report, as the case may be. Serving notice or show cause notice to the specific individual identifier, the subjects of the case. Right? In some cases, there may be requirement to go to enforcement officials. Some cases it may go up to litigation. So you may need support in those cases. Besides all this, how to take forward the court proceeding or how to handle court proceeding is something that you may want to consult the legal counsel on. Well, like I said, these are only broad level guidances on where you may want to consider input or support from a legal counsel. There may be more instances that could be specific. I would suggest that you take specific input on a case-to-case basis from a legal counsel when you have doubt. With that, we come to the end of the presentation. Today, we have actually come across in understanding what are the key elements that one should consider while conducting a compliance investigation, what is the approach one should adopt, and what are the legal considerations that exist, and how to actually represent all the findings in form of a consolidated report. With that, I leave it to Becky for us to take this conversation forward.
Many thanks, Sundar. That was a very detailed presentation, so thank you. I have a few questions that I'd like to go through just before we finish. So I'll start off with the first question. How do you ensure evidence is secure?
So one primary thing one should do is to so there are different types of evidences that we spoke about. It could be a documentation evidence, it could be a digital evidence, or it could be data as an evidence. When we speak about securing an evidence, it is essential for all these three categories. For documentation, it is ideal to put it in sealed envelopes so that you are able to access them at appropriate places and use only photocopies as working copies. Do not have any markings on those evidences, and ensure that the evidences does not have any modifications from the original form. If we speak about digital documentation, it is essential to maintain the chain of custody and validate the hash value wherever there is an extraction of data, so that the file signatures are representable in the port of call. These are the broadly two guidelines that I would say for securing evidences.
Right, thank you. The next question we have is, what essentials to consider while analysing a data?
Well, analyzing data, see, the data could be in any form. Data could be relating to any segment per se. It could be operational data, it could be financial data, or it could be a data relating to MIS, business management, as the case may be. Now, these data, all the types of data will have something called a norm and something called an abnormal exception. So, an investigator should focus on understanding what is the norm. The exception will show itself. So, and they need not put effort to understand what is the exception. That's something I would suggest. That's the essential consideration in my view while doing data analytics.
Thank you. So the next two questions are around the same area. So how important is observing an interviewee during an interview?
So it is the most important aspect, I would say, because like I said about the data analytics part, where you have a norm and the abnormal will show up itself, it is necessary for the investigator to baseline the interview. The baselining is going to happen based on observation, and that observation is unbiased, non-judgmental observation of what the subject is responding on. That observation is extremely critical because that is going to help the investigator in differentiating between what was the original behavior of the interviewee at the time of baselining and how he is responding differently subsequently.
And if there was any conflicts that should have arise during the interview with the interviewee, how would you handle that?
The conflict with the interviewee does happen sometimes, where the interviewee gets agitated or the interviewee reacts to a particular circumstance or gets really emotional. It is essential for the investigator to keep calm and then try and get the interviewee to get calm. It is necessary. If somebody is not in a calm state of mind, they're not responding to you. If they are not responding to you, the objective of the interview is lost. Right? But it is also necessary that the investigator does not get diverted with the emotions of the subject. That's what I would say, to keep themselves calm and then try and calm the other person down.
Thank you. And the last question that I have is, why is it that a whistleblower may not know all the facts?
Yeah, like I said in the presentation, the whistleblower is gathering information from multiple sources. He may not have validated any of those facts. He's just having that information. He would have heard about an incident or a compliance issue while chatting with his friends, or while having a get-together with his friends somewhere or co-workers somewhere. But these information, he may or may not have source to validate it, nor he would have interest to validate it. So his primarily intent is to highlight it as an issue. So sometimes there is a level of perception that is involved in what the whistleblower is saying, because the whistleblower perceives certain things in a certain manner which may not be facts. It is investigators' responsibility to understand what is the fact, what is the allegation, and what is the perception of the whistleblower to make an effective review and then conclude the case as substantiated or otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sundar, and thank you to those who listen in to this recording. If you have any questions on this topic, please do let us know. You can either contact SKP Group with the email address on your screen now, or you can email us at events@ukibc.com, and we will then be sure to pass on your query. So thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Becky. Thanks, everybody. Take care.